The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse apartment as Margaretchen stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Tonight marked 5 years since she had walked down the aisle in a designer gown that cost more than most people's cars, exchanging vows with a man she barely knew. Richard Blackstone, heir to a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions, had been her ticket out of poverty, out of the cramped studio apartment she shared with her dying mother, out of the suffocating weight of medical bills that threatened to crush what remained of her fractured family. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had married for money, yet felt poorer than ever. Not in material terms, of course. The apartment overlooked Central Park. Her closet housed collections from every major fashion house, and her jewelry box contained pieces that could fund small countries. But wealth, she had learned, was a gilded cage when it came without love, without genuine connection, without the kind of partnership she had foolishly believed might grow over time. Margaret had convinced herself that feelings would develop naturally, that Richard's initial coldness was merely the reserved nature of someone raised in privilege, surrounded by people who wanted something from him. She had imagined quiet dinners where they would share stories of their pasts, lazy Sunday mornings reading newspapers in bed, the gradual building of inside jokes and shared memories that would transform their business arrangement into something real. Instead, Richard treated her like an expensive acquisition, beautiful to display at charity galas and business functions, but ultimately decorative. He maintained separate bedrooms under the guise of his irregular work schedule, spoke to her with the same polite distance he used with the household staff, and seemed to view their marriage as just another successful investment in his portfolio. The loneliness had become her constant companion. She filled her days with charity work, art classes, and elaborate dinner parties where she played the role of the perfect socialite wife. But in quiet moments like these, when the facade could finally drop, the emptiness threatened to swallow her whole. She had traded her authentic self for security, and the price felt steeper with each passing year. Tonight was supposed to be different, though. Richard had surprised her by suggesting they celebrate their anniversary at home, just the two of them. He had even dismissed the staff for the evening, something he had never done before. Margaret had allowed herself to hope that perhaps he was finally ready to make their marriage more than just a convenient arrangement. Perhaps the man she had glimpsed in rare, unguarded moments was finally ready to emerge. She had spent hours preparing, choosing a dress that struck the perfect balance between elegant and alluring, arranging flowers throughout the apartment, and coordinating with their chef to prepare Richard's favorite meal before he left for the evening. The dining room table was set with their finest china and crystal, candles casting a warm glow that she hoped might encourage intimacy. But as Margaret applied her lipstick with practiced precision, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Richard had been acting strangely for weeks, taking hushed phone calls that he would abruptly end when she entered the room, spending even more time locked away in his study, and displaying an unusual nervousness that seemed completely out of character for someone typically so composed and controlled. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the apartment, followed by Richard's footsteps on the marble floor. Margaret took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to greet her husband. She had no way of knowing that the next few hours would shatter everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her husband, and the carefully constructed life she had built on what she believed was mutual convenience. The truth waiting for her in the dining room would reveal that she wasn't the only one who had married for reasons other than love. But unlike her straightforward pursuit of financial security, Richard's motivations were far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more devastating than she could have ever imagined. Margaret found Richard standing by the dining room window, his usually impeccable posture somehow diminished. His expensive suit hung differently on his frame, as if the weight of something invisible was pulling him down. When he turned to face her, she was startled by the exhaustion etched into his features. The confident, calculating man she had married looked almost fragile in the candlelight. "You look beautiful," he said, but his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. There was something hollow about the compliment, as if he was reciting lines from a script he no longer believed in. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the apartment. They sat across from each other at the mahogany table that could easily seat 12, the distance between them feeling more pronounced than ever. Richard poured wine with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, a detail that would have escaped notice if Margaret hadn't spent 5 years cataloging his every gesture, searching for cracks in his armor that might reveal the real person beneath. The meal proceeded in stilted conversation about the weather, upcoming social events, and Richard's latest business acquisitions. But Margaret could sense an undercurrent of tension, like electricity in the air before a storm. Richard barely touched his food, instead staring at his wine glass, as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "I need to tell you something," Richard finally said, his words cutting through the pretense like a blade. Margaret's heart began to race, but she maintained her composed exterior. In their world, showing weakness was a luxury neither of them could afford. "I've been lying to you," he continued, meeting her eyes for the first time all evening. "Not just omitting truth, but actively deceiving you about who I am and why we're really married." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly, but she forced herself to remain still. "What do you mean?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, years of social training serving her well even in this moment of crisis. Richard stood abruptly and walked to his study, returning with a manila folder thick with documents. He placed it on the table between them like evidence in a trial. "5 years ago, when I proposed to you, I wasn't just looking for a wife. I was looking for a cover story." The words hung in the air between them, pregnant with implications that Margaret's mind raced to understand. "A cover story for what? My family's business isn't just real estate development, Margaret. It never has been." Richard's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet apartment, his words echoed like gunshots. "We launder money. Massive amounts of money for people who can't afford to have their financial activities scrutinized by federal agencies." Margaret felt as if she were watching the scene unfold from outside her own body. The man she had married, the man whose name opened doors and commanded respect throughout the city, was confessing to crimes that could destroy everything they had built together. The penthouse, the cars, the lifestyle we maintain, it's all part of an elaborate performance designed to make us look like exactly what we appear to be, a wealthy couple living off inherited real estate fortune. But the real money, the money that pays for all of this, comes from washing cash for drug cartels, arms dealers, and worse. Richard opened the folder and spread photographs across the table. Images of men in expensive suits, shaking hands in shadowy locations, shipping containers being loaded at night, bank statements showing massive transfers to offshore accounts. Margaret stared at the evidence of her husband's double life, feeling nauseated by the realization of how completely she had been deceived. "Why are you telling me this now?" she managed to ask, though part of her desperately wished he would stop talking and let her retreat back into ignorance. Richard's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Because it's over. All of it. The FBI has been building a case against my family for 3 years, and they're moving in. Tomorrow morning, federal agents will be here with warrants for my arrest and seizure of all our assets." The implications crashed over Margaret like a tsunami. Not only was her marriage built on lies, but everything they owned, every comfort she had grown accustomed to, would disappear. Worse, she might be considered an accomplice in crimes she never knew existed. "Did you think I knew?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Richard's expression softened for the first time in years, revealing a vulnerability that Margaret had never seen before. "No," he said quietly, reaching across the table as if to touch her hand before thinking better of it. "That's why I chose you, Margaret. You were perfect because you were genuine. Your motivations were transparent, honest even in their calculation. You needed money for your mother's treatment, and I needed a wife who wouldn't ask too many questions about irregular schedules and mysterious business meetings." The admission stung more than Margaret expected. Even in his confession, Richard was reducing her to a carefully selected prop in his elaborate deception. But beneath the hurt, a more disturbing realization was taking shape. If I was chosen specifically because I wouldn't be suspicious, then everything between us has been scripted. Richard finished for her. Every romantic gesture, every gift, Every public display of affection was calculated to maintain our image as a happy, legitimate couple. The separate bedrooms weren't about my work schedule, Margaret. They were about maintaining emotional distance, so I wouldn't compromise the operation by developing real feelings. Margaret felt a strange numbness spreading through her chest. She had married Richard knowing she didn't love him, but she had never imagined that his detachment was equally strategic. The loneliness she had attributed to his upper-class reserve had actually been professional necessity. Even their lack of intimacy had been deliberate, designed to keep their arrangement purely transactional. "There's more," Richard continued, his voice growing even quieter. "The charity work you've been doing, the organizations I encouraged you to join, they weren't random suggestions. Several of them have been unknowingly facilitating money transfers through their international aid programs. Your involvement provided perfect cover and credibility." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital, her position on the board of the International Relief Organization, her fundraising efforts for disaster victims, all of it had been tainted by association with criminal activity. People she cared about, causes she genuinely believed in, had been corrupted without her knowledge. "So my mother's medical bills," Margaret said slowly, pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. "The treatments that saved her life, that money came from drug money, primarily. Some from weapons trafficking." Richard's honesty was brutal in its precision. "Your mother is alive because we used blood money to pay for her care." Margaret pushed back from the table so violently that her chair toppled backward. She needed distance from Richard, from the table, from the suffocating weight of these revelations. Her mother's recovery, the one pure and beautiful outcome of her marriage, was now poisoned by its source. "Why tell me this now?" she demanded, her composure finally cracking. "If you've managed to keep me in the dark for 5 years, why destroy that now when everything is falling apart anyway?" Richard stood as well, but remained on his side of the table, respecting the space she had created between them. "Because you deserve to know before the FBI agents arrive tomorrow. Because you need time to decide how you want to handle this. And because—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed foreign to him. "Because in spite of everything, in spite of the lies and the manipulation and the careful emotional distance I maintained, I did develop feelings for you. Real feelings." The confession should have brought her some satisfaction, some validation that their marriage hadn't been completely hollow. Instead, it felt like another manipulation, another strategic move in a game she was only now learning existed. "You're telling me you love me," Margaret said, her voice dripping with disbelief, "on the same night you reveal that our entire relationship is built on criminal activity and lies. I'm telling you that somewhere along the way, the performance became real for me. That watching you navigate our social circle with grace while maintaining your own moral compass, seeing you dedicate yourself to causes you believed in, observing the way you cared for your mother, even when the doctor said there was no hope, it changed something in me." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "How convenient that you discovered your capacity for genuine emotion just as your criminal enterprise is about to collapse." Richard flinched at her words, but he didn't defend himself. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out at the city lights that had always seemed to sparkle with promise, but now felt cold and distant. "You're right to be skeptical," he said. "I've given you no reason to trust anything I say. But there's something else you need to know, something that changes everything." Margaret remained standing by the overturned chair, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. She wasn't sure she could handle any more revelations, but she also knew there was no going back to ignorance now. What else could there possibly be? The investigation that's bringing everything down, the federal case that's going to destroy my family's operation. Richard turned to face her, his expression grave. "It started because of you." The words made no sense. Margaret shook her head, trying to process what he was suggesting. "That's impossible. I didn't even know about any of this until tonight." "Not directly," Richard said, moving slowly back toward the table as if approaching a wounded animal. "But your charity work, your genuine dedication to those causes I encouraged you to join, it attracted attention. You were too good at your job, too passionate, too thorough in your oversight of the organization's financial activities." Margaret felt the world shifting beneath her feet again. What are you saying? The international relief organization you've been working with, the one where you insisted on personally reviewing aid distribution reports because you wanted to ensure maximum impact? Those reports revealed discrepancies in fund allocation that didn't make sense to you. You started asking questions. A memory surfaced unbidden. Margaret remembered staying up late several months ago, poring over financial documents that seemed to show money being redirected through unnecessarily complex routing systems. She had mentioned her concerns to the organization's director, suggesting they might want to investigate potential inefficiencies in their distribution network. "I was trying to help them be more effective," she whispered, the implications of her actions beginning to dawn on her. "I know," Richard said gently, "but your recommendations triggered an internal audit that revealed the money laundering operation." The organization's director, being a responsible leader, reported the suspicious activities to federal authorities. That report launched the investigation that's been closing in on my family for the past year. Margaret sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Her genuine desire to help people, her authentic commitment to charitable causes, had inadvertently brought down the criminal empire that funded her comfortable life. The irony was so complete it felt almost scripted. "So I destroyed us," she said numbly. "My honesty, my integrity, the very qualities you said you needed in a wife who wouldn't ask questions, those are what exposed everything." "No," Richard said firmly, moving closer but still maintaining careful distance. "My family's crimes destroyed us. Your integrity just brought the truth to light." Margaret looked up at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The confident, cold businessman was gone, replaced by a man who looked genuinely remorseful, genuinely afraid, and genuinely in love with a woman he had married as part of an elaborate lie. "There's one more thing," Richard said, and Margaret almost laughed at the absurdity of there being yet another revelation. "The money I used to pay for your mother's treatment, I didn't take it from the family operation. I used my personal inheritance, money that came from legitimate real estate investments my grandfather made decades before the family got involved in money laundering." Margaret stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception. "Why does that matter now?" "Because it means your mother's recovery wasn't built on blood money. It was built on clean money, money I chose to spend because I genuinely wanted to help you. It was the first real decision I made in our marriage, the first time I acted on actual feelings rather than strategic calculation." The confession should have provided some relief, but Margaret felt too emotionally battered to process what it meant. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, and her own role in both had been systematically dismantled over the course of a single dinner. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Now you have a choice to make," Richard replied. "Tomorrow morning, federal agents will arrive with arrest warrants and asset seizure orders. They'll want to question you extensively about your knowledge of family business operations. If you cooperate fully and honestly, if you help them understand that you were as much a victim of this deception as anyone else, you'll likely avoid criminal charges." Margaret stared at the manila folders still spread across their anniversary dinner table, the photographs of Richard's criminal associates, now seeming to stare back at her like accusers in some twisted trial. The candles she had lit with such hope hours earlier now cast long shadows that danced mockingly across the evidence of her husband's deception. "But there's another option," Richard continued, his voice taking on an urgency she had never heard before. "I have money hidden away, clean money that the FBI doesn't know about. Enough for us to disappear, to start over somewhere else with new identities. We could leave tonight, be in a non-extradition country by morning." The proposition hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret found herself considering it, imagining a life on some distant beach where Richard wouldn't be the heir to a criminal empire, and she wouldn't be the unknowing accomplice who brought it all crashing down. But even as the fantasy took shape in her mind, she knew it was impossible. "You're asking me to become a fugitive," she said slowly, "to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, cut off from everyone I've ever cared about, living a lie that's even bigger than the one I've been living for 5 years. I'm asking you to give us a chance to build something real," Richard replied, moving closer until he was standing directly across from her. "Away from my family's influence, away from the criminal organization, away from all the reasons I had to keep you at arm's length. I'm asking you to let me show you who I really am when I'm not performing a role. Margaret looked into her husband's eyes and saw something she had never seen before: vulnerability, desperation, and what appeared to be genuine love. But she also saw the same calculating intelligence that had made him successful in his criminal enterprises. How could she trust that this wasn't just another performance, another strategic manipulation designed to secure her cooperation in his escape plan? "If you really love me," she said quietly, "if your feelings are genuine and not just another convenient fiction, then you'll understand why I can't run away with you." Richard's face fell, but he didn't interrupt as she continued. "The woman you say you fell in love with, the woman whose integrity and moral compass you claim to admire, that woman can't become a fugitive to protect a man who built their entire relationship on lies. That would destroy the very person you say you love." The truth of her words settled between them like a verdict. Margaret realized that in articulating her position, she had also discovered something important about herself. Despite the comfortable life Richard's money had provided, despite the security she had gained by marrying him, she wasn't willing to compromise her fundamental values to preserve those benefits. "What about your mother?" Richard asked, grasping for any argument that might change her mind. "If I'm arrested and our assets are seized, how will you continue paying for her ongoing medical care? The experimental treatments that have kept her cancer in remission aren't covered by insurance." The question struck at Margaret's deepest fear, the same vulnerability that had driven her to accept Richard's proposal 5 years earlier. Her mother's health remained fragile, requiring expensive monitoring and preventive treatments that could easily bankrupt a person of ordinary means. But Margaret had learned something during their marriage that she hadn't expected. She was stronger than she had believed. The charity work that had inadvertently exposed Richard's crimes had also connected her with resources and people who valued her skills and dedication. She had built a network of professional relationships that existed independently of Richard's money and influence. "I'll figure it out," she said with more confidence than she felt. "There are programs for people in our situation, foundations that help families dealing with expensive medical care. I'll apply for every grant, every assistance program, every resource available. I'll work 3 jobs if I have to." Richard studied her face, perhaps seeing for the first time the steel beneath the elegant exterior he had married. "You're really going to stay and face this?" "I'm going to stay and tell the truth," Margaret corrected. "I'm going to cooperate with the federal investigation, help them understand how your family used charitable organizations to launder money, and work to minimize the damage to innocent people who were unknowingly involved." The decision crystallized as she spoke it aloud. Margaret realized that for the first time in their marriage, she was making a choice based entirely on her own values rather than on financial necessity or social expectation. The irony wasn't lost on her that discovering her husband's criminal activities had also revealed her own moral clarity. "And us?" Richard asked quietly. "Is there any possibility of an us after tomorrow?" Margaret considered the question seriously, looking at this man who had been both her salvation and her deceiver, who had given her security while stealing her authenticity, who claimed to love her while systematically lying to her for 5 years. Margaret walked to the window where Richard had stood earlier, pressing her palms against the cool glass as she gazed out at the city that had been their stage for this elaborate performance. The lights below seemed different now, less like stars and more like the cold, distant illumination of an interrogation room. "I don't know," she said finally, her breath fogging the window. "I don't know if there can be an us, because I don't know who us really is. 4 or 5 years, I've been married to a character you created, and you've been married to a woman you selected like a piece of furniture that would complement your deception." Richard moved closer, stopping just behind her. She could feel his presence, could smell his familiar cologne, could sense the tension radiating from his body. "But what if we could start over? What if I cooperate with the authorities, serve whatever time they give me, and when it's over, we try to build something genuine?" Margaret turned to face him, and for a moment, she saw not the cold businessman or the desperate criminal, but simply a man who had lost his way and was asking for a chance at redemption. The part of her that had once believed love could grow from practical arrangements wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that their marriage could be rebuilt on a foundation of truth. "You're asking me to wait for you," she said, "to put my life on hold while you pay the price for choices you made long before you met me. You're asking me to forgive not just the lies, but the fact that you made me an unwitting participant in crimes that hurt people. I'm asking you to consider that maybe the woman I fell in love with and the man I became because of that love are real, even if everything else was fake." Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time that evening. The raw honesty in his voice was more intimate than anything they had shared in 5 years of marriage. But intimacy built on the ruins of massive deception felt too fragile to trust. "I need time," she whispered. "I need to get through tomorrow and the investigation and the trial. I need to rebuild my own life independent of all of this. I need to discover who I am when I'm not playing the role of Richard Blackstone's wife." Richard nodded slowly, accepting her decision with a grace that surprised her. "And after all that, if I serve my time and prove that my feelings for you were genuine, would you consider giving us another chance?" Margaret reached out and touched his face gently, a gesture more tender than any they had shared in years. "Ask me again in 5 years," she said. "Ask me when we're both free to choose each other for real." The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching the somber mood that had settled over the penthouse after their conversation ended near midnight. Margaret had spent the sleepless hours packing a single suitcase with essentials, knowing that everything else would soon belong to federal investigators. She chose simple clothes, sentimental jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, and photographs of her mother, leaving behind the designer gowns and expensive accessories that had never really felt like hers anyway. Richard sat in his study, organizing documents that would help prosecutors understand the full scope of his family's operation. His cooperation would be crucial in minimizing sentences for lower-level participants who, like Margaret, had been unwitting pawns in a larger game. The sound of papers rustling mixed with the distant hum of city traffic, creating a soundtrack for the end of their carefully constructed world. When the federal agents arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, Margaret was surprised by their professionalism and courtesy. Agent Sarah Martinez, a woman about Margaret's age with kind eyes and a firm handshake, explained that Margaret was considered a witness rather than a suspect, but that her cooperation would be essential in unraveling the money laundering network. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, he caught Margaret's eye one last time. The look they shared contained 5 years of complicated history, the weight of revelations that had shattered their understanding of themselves and each other, and something that might have been love, finally honest and unguarded. 6 months later, Margaret testified before a federal grand jury, her detailed knowledge of charity operations proving invaluable in securing convictions against the organized crime figures who had exploited humanitarian organizations for profit. Her mother's medical bills were covered by a victims' compensation fund, and Margaret found work as a consultant helping nonprofits strengthen their financial oversight procedures. Richard received a 10-year sentence, reduced to 7 for his cooperation. Margaret visited him once, on the first anniversary of that terrible dinner, not to reconcile, but to tell him that she was filing for divorce. She needed to close that chapter completely before she could begin writing a new one. Standing outside the prison after that final visit, Margaret realized that the woman who had married for money 5 years earlier no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had learned that authenticity was worth more than security, that integrity couldn't be purchased, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's self-destruction. She never remarried, but she built a life filled with meaningful work, genuine relationships, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every choice she made was truly her own. The penthouse and its expensive trappings had been illusions, but the strength she discovered in their aftermath was completely real.